So that is the description of the flow of life. Our attitude to the flow of life, which is the attitude on which the 5 forms of suffering arise, is a very specific attitude. So we should ask, what is my attitude to the flow of life that leads to suffering? And what is the attitude to the flow of life that leads to peace of mind? And the answer is very simple. The attitude to the flow of life that leads to suffering is the attitude of personal doership, which sees oneself as the doer of everything that you think, feel, say, and act or do. And therefore you see the other in the same way as a separate, independent entity that is in complete control of everything that it says, feels, thinks, and does. That is one half of the attitude that leads, the attitude to the flow of life that leads to suffering, and the other half of the attitude to the flow of life that leads to suffering is the attitude that says my completeness, my happiness, my centeredness is completely dependent on outcomes. And therefore we are seeking for life to be pleasure, 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 because we believe that it is the outcomes in the flow of life that will deliver a sense of fulfillment. We believe it is outcomes in the flow of life that will remove this sense of uncomfortableness that we have found that is part of our life experience. And if that is the attitude to the flow of life, those 2 components, then really we can say that that is a deeply ingrained belief system in the person that we can call the false psychological self. It is that psychological self that effectively interacts with the flow of life. Now, that psychological self, I am the doer, the other is the doer, and my happiness is to be found in outcomes, has a very tough time with the flow of life that is sometimes pleasure and sometimes pain. Because what it is saying is, I am defined by outcomes. What I am is linked to outcomes. That's what the belief that says my happiness is to be found in outcomes is saying, is I am identified with outcomes. I am dependent on outcomes. So you can see how that psychological identity is bound to freak out when it is put in daily life. Now, it doesn't freak out because daily life is delivering pain sometimes, because even if life delivered pleasure, 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 what we would find is the suffering would still be there, because that psychological identity will be worrying about when the pleasure in life is going to stop. And the psychological identity by default is not who we are, so there has to be an intrinsic uncomfortableness with it. For as long as we are disconnected from ourselves, there will be an uncomfortableness in life. Because our happiness isn't to be found in pleasure, pleasure, pleasure. So even if we got pleasure, 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 there will still be this uncomfortableness of that psychological self. Now, because all of this is deeply ingrained, when we feel the uncomfortableness, we don't know where it's coming from. So that's why the body-mind system has said, I feel uncomfortable because circumstance isn't. the way it is, or the way I would like it to be. And so it has set out with a mission to make circumstance better. It has set out with a mission to control circumstance. And that only reinforces the identity that my happiness is to be found in outcomes, which means even more uncomfortableness pervading the life experience. And we still don't know where that's coming from. We feel more uncomfortableness, and then we say, it's because my partner did this, my friend did this, the stranger on the street did that, I did this and it was not up to scratch. And that is the attitude to life, that is the attitude that maintains the false sense of self. The notion that my completeness will one day be found when life is perfect, and the attitude that says, you weren't perfect, I wasn't perfect, you should have done this, you didn't do that, I didn't do this, I should have done that, which is the doership. And what is the attitude to the flow of life that leads to peace of mind? It's the dissolving of the attitude to the flow of life that leads to suffering. So the attitude that leads to suffering is the attitude of personal doership and attachment to outcome. The attitude that leads to peace of mind we could call an attitude of non-doership, an attitude of non-attachment. But that attitude of non-doership and non-attachment is not the positive belief system that, oh, I am not the doer, my happiness isn't to be found in the flow of life. It is the dissolving of the opposite attitude that says, I am the doer, and the dissolving of the belief that says, my happiness is to be found in the flow of life. So really the peace of mind is based on the attitude of non-doership and non-attachment, which is the dissolving of that attitude. So, this is leading us through this step by step. If we are seeking peace of mind in daily living, it makes sense that we have to understand what peace of mind is, the end of suffering. It makes sense that we have to understand what suffering is. It's an attitude to the flow of life. It makes sense that we have to understand what the flow of life is in nature, sometimes pleasure and sometimes pain. Then it makes sense that we have to understand what the basis of the attitude to the flow of life is that leads to the 5 forms of suffering. And it's been described here as the attitude of doership and attachment to outcome. It's been described that the peace of mind is the dissolving of that attitude of doership and attachment to outcome. And so now let's look at how those 2 attitudes translate into and manifest as the different forms of suffering. Guilt and shame, blame and hatred, pride and arrogance. So really it's guilt, blame and pride. Guilt manifests as the feeling of shame. Blame manifests as the feeling of hatred. Pride manifests as the feeling of arrogance. But what is guilt, blame based on? Guilt is the attitude to a circumstance whereby this body-mind organism, me, has functioned a particular way, and the outcome delivers pain to myself or someone I love, which is then pain for me. And when I function in such a way that delivers pain, if the attachment to outcome is in place, which is the belief that my happiness is to be found in outcomes, I see that pain and I say, that is an attack on myself. That outcome is an attack on myself because it is delivering pain to me. It is delivering an outcome that is not favorable to me. So for example, there is anger and I shout at someone and upset them And then I don't feel good. I feel pain that I've upset someone. So at that stage, it's all biological. Pleasure or pain in the moment. And in this case, pain in the moment. The attitude of doership and attachment to outcome sees that pain and it says, where did that pain come from? The pain came from my actions. So that pain was me attacking my own happiness, is what this psychological identity, how it relates to it. And then it says, I am the doer of that pain. I could have functioned much more civilly. I shouldn't have got angry. And it feels guilt for getting angry. Guilt essentially means I'm not good enough. I didn't perform well enough. I am a failure. So as soon as it concludes, I am guilty, that is the attitude of guilt, and it manifests as a feeling of shame. A sense that I am not a worthy human being because anger happened through me. That's the guilt. Blame is based on the same principle of personal doership and seeing pain as an attack on who I am. But instead of it being an attitude towards actions that happen through me, it's an attitude of attachment to outcome and doership for actions that happen through the other. The other shouted at me, which is pain being delivered from the other. I receive that pain not just as pain in the moment, but as an attack on who I believe myself to be. This psychological identity receives the pain and says, how dare you deliver pain to me? That is the opposite of what I need in order to be complete. And it is you as a separate independent doer that is delivering that pain to me. You could act differently. I hate you for you delivering the pain to me, which is an attack on who I am. I hate you because you could have and should have done it differently. So that blame based on the belief in personal doership and the assessment that pain is an attack on who I am at my core. Really, it is an assessment by the psychological entity that is just a belief system, has no idea what the human being really is at its core, and so creates all this nonsense. It's quite funny from one angle, a bit tragic from another angle. Pride and arrogance is in a way a lighter form of suffering than shame, less dense, but still nonetheless coming from this psychological identity that means a not knowing who we are, and therefore it is uncomfortableness with oneself. It is a form of suffering, and it is applying the same principle of personal doership and attachment to outcomes. And it is looking at those actions that happen through me that deliver a positive outcome. And then it says, look at what I have done as the doer. Me, the doer, look how good I am that I am producing these results. I am delivering pleasure to myself. And I expect the others to deliver pleasure to me when they realize what good results I am delivering. And so that is the identity of pride that feels defined by the pleasure that is happening through the body and is taking ownership over that pleasure through the false interpretation that the action that happens through this body is in the control of this fictitious psychological entity that comes in after the action and claims ownership as if it created it. And that psychological identity in itself is not the body-mind organism that is performing the actions which turn out to be pleasurable or painful. It is a fictitious psychological identity that has no idea about how life works and is imagining life works a certain way, in which it is attributing responsibility to this psychological identity that doesn't produce anything except for uncomfortableness and suffering through its attitude to the flow of life, which is a happening according to God's will. So the pride based on the belief in personal doership and attachment to outcome, just like the blame and the guilt. So you can see that half of human suffering, the guilt, blame and pride, based on this notion that I am the doer and my happiness is to be found in the flow of life. Now, worry and anxiety is based on the notion that my happiness is to be found in outcomes, and we are worried and anxious about what the outcome in the future will be because of what it means to who I am. Pretty simple. In its extreme form, it is anxiety. In its less extreme form, it's worry. And expectation and attachment to outcome, also a way of reacting to how the circumstance unfolds. That is the feeling that if we missed our flight, which is really just pain in the moment, the feeling that, no, this can't have happened. But not because it can't have happened because I can't afford another $800, which might be the case. It's not just that, but it penetrates down, and we can feel when we say, no, this can't have happened. It starts off because of the financial pain, but then it turns into this sense that it is an attack on who I am. And so attachment to outcome is the feeling that arises, that is a feeling of attack on who I am when circumstance turns out painfully. Expectation is something a little different, but can turn into attachment to outcome, the feeling of attachment to outcome, if the expectation isn't met. So the suffering of expectation can be the simple thinking about something you would like to happen in the future that isn't happening now. And that thinking can, and usually is, obsessive. We're continually imagining some sort of success, some sort of outcome, like meeting our soulmate or our business venture becoming very widely accepted, some sort of creation that we make that will allow us to feel worthy and valuable and content. So we have this expectation, and the expectation is about outcomes, and it's an expectation that that outcome will deliver contentment. We can have expectations about spiritual practice, expectations about peak experiences, expectations about enlightenment. And expectation can take two forms. You can have an expectation that is misguided, like the expectation that enlightenment is about oneness experiences, for example. So that is an expectation that is off the mark, and it will cause its own problems because it is off the mark. And for as long as we are thinking about that and waiting for it to happen, that thinking, which is what we can call the thinking of expectation, is disturbing our resting in the present moment. Because resting in the present moment is essentially saying, actually, I am, I exist, I'm okay. I don't need that to be complete. So while we're thinking about, I'm really looking forward to going out on this holiday because I suspect that I'm going to meet lots of people, and that's where I'll find my soulmate. And so we're really excited about something because we have this expectation that my happiness will be delivered at that time. And then if it isn't, the expectation turns into the feeling of attachment to outcome, the feeling of disappointment. Because inevitably what we expected will deliver some continuous happiness doesn't, because it's pleasure and it can't. So you can see how expectation is this continually disturbing of the present moment, even when the expectation hasn't crystallized yet. So you can be expecting something for years and years and years, which actually delivers a sense that I'm not complete yet, and I will be one day. And its expectation is a subtle suffering to some extent. At first, we don't think it's suffering because we think, I'm looking forward to something good. It's only when we realize how disturbing that thinking and looking forward to something good is compared to just resting in being. We realize it is the obstacle that prevents us from resting in being. And that's when we start having a reason to say, stop thinking about how things are going to turn out in the future. Even if that thinking is hopeful and positive, stop and just be. It doesn't mean you don't plan for something in the future, but you make your plans, which are just the practical things you need to do. Once that's done, let it go and wait and see what turns out. So in business, if you need to do some forward thinking, by all means, that's not the thinking of expectation and the thinking of the thinking mind. That's the working mind. And it says, in order to meet this objective, I need to do this, this and this. And the working mind says that objective is actually going to be pleasure if it happens, not my happiness. And the working mind says pleasure is not a bad thing. I would rather pleasure than pain, so let me try and put things in place. And then once you've done what you need to do, no need to keep thinking about it. So this brings me into the description of the working mind versus the thinking mind. Thinking in life is necessary. You can't function without thought. It is the thinking of the thinking mind, which I've been referring to throughout this talk. The thinking of the thinking mind are the different forms of suffering. They are the attitude to the flow of life, guilt, blame, pride, worry, and expectation. And in its intense, concentrated form, the thinking mind doesn't present itself as thoughts, but presents itself as bodily sensation or feeling, a feeling of uncomfortableness. Essentially, that feeling of uncomfortableness has the narrative of the thinking mind in it, but in a very concentrated form. And you will only see the narrative if you connect to that emotion and put words onto it. And then when you put the words onto it, you'll realize that the feeling of despair might be, I'm not good enough to live in this life, and I'm never going to succeed. And that's when an uncomfortable feeling of despair can present itself as actually a concentrated version of the narrative of guilt. The working mind, on the other hand, can function as thinking. It is functional thinking. It is the part of the intellect that will work out when you need to order a taxi in order to get to the airport on time, how much money you need to take on holiday with you. It works out what food to get at the grocery store. It's part of your sensibility of being able to look after yourself, wash, know how to use a knife and fork. All of that is part of the functional functioning of the human being. And when that functional aspect of the human being includes functional thinking, we call that the working mind. So this talk is talking to the working mind. It is delivering conceptual descriptions about the topic of happiness in daily living. And it's describing all of the components so that the working mind at some point will contemplate these concepts and start to understand them more and more deeply, and start to investigate whether the concepts are correct or not based on an investigation of one's own life experience. So when you get to the airport next time and you see that you have arrived exactly 3 hours before your flight, and the thought arises, this is pleasure in the moment. So you can put a tick next to the concept. I have tested it out for myself that circumstance in this moment is either pleasure or pain. It's pleasure in the moment because I have arrived 3 hours before my flight. It hasn't been delayed, and that is in line with my biological preferences. Yes, circumstance is pleasure in the moment. Someone pushes in front of you in the line, and the attitude of blame arises, and the working mind might kick in, and there will be a awareness of the uncomfortableness of blame, and the working mind might say, this is suffering in the moment based on my attitude to the person that has pushed in front of me, my attitude that if he pushes in front of me, that's an attack on who I am, and my attitude that sees him as the doer rather than seeing this as part of the unfolding of a much broader life experience. So seeing him as the doer rather seeing him as an instrument through which my destined pain in the moment is being delivered. So as this happens, as the working mind starts to see life more and more frequently along the lines that are being described, which is a natural occurrence. You don't have to do this. You are being conditioned now. You don't have to do anything to be conditioned. Just sitting in the environment is the new conditioning being delivered, the up-to-date conditioning changing, and then you find yourself functioning according to your up-to-date conditioning. Meaning the thought arises, him pushing in front of me is pain in the moment. This uncomfortableness is blame, my attitude to the circumstance. That's not something that you do, it's something that arises because the situation has inspired it relative to your current makeup. If you hadn't sat in satsang, the new conditioning that is being delivered here wouldn't be what was delivered to you. It wouldn't become part of your up-to-date conditioning. You would find yourself in the line at the airport. The person would push in front of you. The anger would arise. The blame on top of the anger would be there. And the thought, this is pain in the moment. The uncomfortableness is my suffering. Not caused by him, but caused by my own internal makeup that relates to the pain of him pushing in front and turns it into blame. So it is my creation, or the body-mind organism's creation. Often we project the blame outwards and say, you caused the blame. They were the instrument through which pain was delivered in the flow of life. The blame was an internal reaction that may or may not have happened depending on your internal makeup. That doesn't mean that we should blame ourselves for that suffering, because the understanding realizes I was conditioned by life to be this way, based on my genes and up-to-date conditioning. So I was designed by life to be this way, and I can't help but blame the person if the attitude of doership and attachment to outcome is there. So all of this thinking is not suffering. That thinking is the functioning of the working mind. It is functional thinking that in it doesn't include suffering. The blame itself that might arise is of the thinking mind. That is the suffering. But the recognition of the various components is the working mind. And the working mind is not part of the suffering. The working mind can be there and it doesn't disturb our peace of mind.